Here's a thing I've watched happen to good anglers for years. You find summer walleye on your electronics. You mark them, a whole pot of them, sitting right where every article told you they'd be, out on the deep rock in 20-some feet of water, and they will not eat. Not a jig, not a crawler, not a leech. You leave thinking you did something wrong. You didn't. You were fishing yesterday's spot. In summer, a walleye's address is not a place. It's a moving target, and it gets pushed around by three things no screen on your boat can see: oxygen, current, and food. Everybody talks about the heat, and the heat is real. When the surface climbs up past the low 80s, that's stressful water for a walleye, and the fish that were shallow all spring go looking for somewhere to breathe. A walleye is most comfortable somewhere in the upper 60s into the low 70s. Push much past that, and it starts hunting for relief. But heat is only the trigger. The thing that actually decides where the fish end up is those three invisible forces. And here's the part the fishing industry has no reason to ever spell out for you. Not one of the three can be patented, bottled, or hung on a peg at the tackle shop. You can't sell oxygen. You can't sell current. You can't sell the timing of a bug hatch. So the whole conversation gets steered toward the stuff they can sell you: a bigger screen, a faster boat, one more box of lures. Today we're talking about the three things they leave out. By the end, you'll read a summer lake in a way that puts you on fish, while the boat next to you is still staring at a screen. And before any of it, check your state and local regulations. Seasons, limits, and slot rules are different everywhere, and they matter more in summer than any other time, for a reason I'll come back to. Let's start with oxygen, because it quietly rules everything else. Warm water simply holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. That's not opinion, it's chemistry you can look up in any limnology text. So when a lake heats up, the fish don't just get uncomfortable from the temperature, whole sections of the lake become hard to breathe in, especially down deep, where the water is coldest but the oxygen has been used up and never replaced. That's the trap sitting inside the standard advice. Everybody says go deeper, find the cooler water, but half the time the coolest water in the lake is also the deadest. No oxygen, no bait, no walleye. So where does the oxygen actually live in July? It lives where something is still making it, or still stirring it in. Green, growing weeds are an oxygen factory in daylight. That's photosynthesis, the plants pumping oxygen into the water around them. Which is exactly why a deep, healthy cabbage bed is one of the best walleye spots of the summer, and why a weed bed that's gone brown and slimy is one of the worst. Dying weeds do the opposite of growing ones. They rot, and rot pulls oxygen back out of the water. So the lesson nobody sells you is simple. Don't just find weeds. Find green weeds, tall enough to throw shade, still growing. Now here's a spot the tackle industry will never point you to, because there's nothing to sell beside it. That deep, low carpet you see on your graph out on the 20 to 30-foot flats, anglers call it sandgrass or chara or musk grass. It isn't really grass at all. It's a stiff, crunchy algae, and it's one of the richest little worlds in the whole lake. It holds clouds of insect larvae. It holds scuds and freshwater shrimp. It holds crayfish, which means it holds bait, and bait means walleye. Sitting out on a flat you'd have driven right past. Find that low, crunchy carpet at a depth the fish can breathe in, and you've found a summer kitchen most of the boats on the lake don't even know is there. The second invisible force is current, moving water. And this is where I'll correct a piece of common advice that's backwards half the time. In spring, everybody fishes the windy shore, and for good reason. But in a summer heat wave, wind does something most folks get exactly wrong. When a steady wind blows across a lake for a day or two, it shoves the warm surface water to the far shore, the downwind side. That warm water piles up over there, and to replace it, cold water rises up from the depths on the side the wind is coming from. Scientists call that upwelling. So on a big lake, after a good blow, the cooler, fresher, better oxygenated water is often on the upwind shore, the side that's been taking the wind in the face. Most people run to the calm side to get out of the chop. The fish are frequently stacked on the rough side, in that cold upwelling, feeding. It's uncomfortable fishing. It's also where the walleye are. Then there's real current, moving water from outside the lake. And this might be the most underused summer spot going. A cold creek, a river inlet, a spring, even a trickle of a tributary. It does three good things at once. It brings in cooler water, it brings in fresh oxygen, and the tumbling stirs in even more oxygen on top of that. A little cold water inflow in the corner of a hot lake is an oasis. Walleye stack at the mouth of it, and on lakes fed by trout streams, they'll run right up into the cooler river to feed through the worst of the heat. Same story with a channel between two lakes, or a current seam below a bridge. And if that bridge is throwing shade over the current, better still. And don't underrate shade all on its own. On dark water flowages and reservoirs, the weeds quit growing down around 6 or 8 feet because the light can't reach any deeper. Below that, the only cover and the only shade a walleye has is wood. Stumps, laydowns, standing timber. Find the deepest wood you can and fish the shady side of it. If the sun's coming out of the south, the fish tuck on the north side of that stump, in the shadow. Shade is cover you can't buy and can't bring with you. It's just there, if you know to look for the dark side of things. Now the third force, and this is the one that'll change how you read a dead bite, food. Sometimes the walleye aren't relating to structure at all. They're relating to a meal. Out in the open basin of a lot of lakes, there are huge clouds of bait suspended over deep water. Ciscos, tullibes, young perch, shad, depending on where you fish. And walleye follow them out there and roam. That's the basin bite. And forward-facing sonar has turned it into something you can actually chase now, instead of just trolling and hoping. Follow the bait, find the fish. But here's the food story almost nobody explains, and it's behind more ruined summer trips than heat ever caused. The bugs. In early to midsummer, on soft-bottomed lakes across the walleye belt, Lake Erie is the famous one, but it happens on countless inland lakes too. The mayflies hatch. Not the little ones. The big burrowing mayflies, the hexagenia. These insects spend close to 2 years as larvae, buried in the soft mud at the bottom of the lake. Then, triggered by the bottom water temperature and the angle of the light, they all come up at once, by the millions, sometimes billions. And every fish in the lake gorges, walleye, perch, smallmouth, all of them, stuffing themselves on emerging larvae drifting up off the mud. When that's going on, your jig might as well be invisible. There is so much easy food in the water that a lure just doesn't register. This is the answer to the classic summer mystery. You found the fish, you marked the fish, and they will not eat for the better part of a week. It probably wasn't the heat, it was the hatch. And the good news hiding inside that bad news, it tells you exactly where the fish went. Off the hard rock onto the soft bottom flats where the bugs come up. Now I'll be straight with you, the way this channel tries to be. This one's debated on the water. Ask 10 Lake Erie captains whether the mayfly hatch kills the walleye bite, and you'll get a real argument. Some swear it shuts down for days. Others say there are so many walleye out there that a handful are always willing. You just have to match the hatch. Go small. Go to a slow-crawled harness, a little bug-sized profile, and slow everything way down. Both camps are catching fish, so both are onto something real. But almost none of them will tell you that a returning mayfly hatch is a sign of a healthy lake. Those bugs were nearly wiped out of Lake Erie back in the pollution years of the 60s and 70s, and their comeback is one of the great quiet water quality stories in the country. Nobody sells you that either. There's no product in a clean water bug. So let's take all three of those forces and aim them at the single worst piece of summer walleye advice out there. Go deeper. You've heard it your whole life. When it gets hot, walleye go deep. And on some lakes, that's exactly right. But on most of the water Americans actually fish, following that line sends you straight to the deadest part of the lake. Here's why. That whole deep equals cool and safe idea only works on a lake that stratifies. A deep, clear lake that separates into layers in summer, with a cold, oxygen-holding middle layer the fish can use. Plenty of lakes do that, but a lot of walleye water doesn't stratify at all. Shallow prairie lakes, most reservoirs and rivers, the wind and the current keep them stirred top to bottom, so there's no cool, deep refuge waiting down there. On that kind of water, when you drop into the deepest hole, you aren't finding a cold sanctuary. You might be finding warm, oxygen-starved water with nothing living in it. And on rivers especially, walleye do the opposite of going deep. They push to the current, to the oxygen, to the shade, often shallow, right where the water's alive. So the honest version is this: go deep in summer isn't a rule. It's a rule for one specific kind of lake. Before you trust it, ask what kind of water you're standing on. Does your lake even have a thermocline, that sharp temperature layer partway down? On a lot of lakes, the answer is no, and the whole go deep gospel falls apart. This is exactly the sort of thing the industry has no reason to tell you. Because your lake is different doesn't move product. A one-size answer that sends everybody out to buy deep water gear does. And that brings me to the hardest thing on this list, and the reason I flagged the rules up top. If you do go deep for summer walleye, you need to understand barotrauma, because you may be killing fish you believe you're releasing. A walleye can't burp air out of its swim bladder the fast way. It has to bleed the gas out slowly, through its blood. So when you crank one up quickly from deep water, that bladder swells and can't keep up. The fish comes up bloated, its stomach may be pushed up into its throat, its eyes bulging, and it can't swim back down. You let it go, it swims off, you feel good about it, and a day later it's dead on the bottom. That's not a scare story. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources flatly recommends fishing shallower than about 30 feet when you plan to release sensitive fish like walleye, and if you're going deeper, to plan on keeping what you catch. Peer-reviewed work on tournament-caught walleye found that fish showing real barotrauma can die at rates as high as 1 in 2, even after swimming off clean. Water pressure roughly doubles in the first 33 feet down, which is why that range keeps turning up as where the trouble starts. So what does a thoughtful angler actually do about it in summer? Simple. If you're fishing catch and release, work that shallower, livable band and the low-light shallows instead of grinding fish up off the deep basin. And if you are pulling fish from deep water, plan to keep your legal limit for the table rather than releasing a pile of fish that won't survive the trip back down. That's not only ethics. In a lot of places, it's the smarter reading of the rules. So, one more time, check your state and local regulations, because slot limits and depth realities go hand in summer. All right, you've found the living water. Let's talk about putting a bait in it, and then the cheap little tools that beat the expensive ones. In hot water, walleye have a buffet in front of them, so they get lazy and picky, and I lean on presentations that look like an easy, natural meal. A plain jig and half a nightcrawler swum slowly just over their heads is hard to beat. Up there it looks like a bug, and a summer walleye is eating a lot of bugs. A slip bobber and a leech, set to hover right at the fish's depth, will outfish fancier rigs on a tough day, if you can still get lively leeches that late in the year. And for covering water, a slow-rolled crawler harness behind a little weight, over the tops of the green weeds, across that crunchy chara flat, has a finesse to it that draws bites when a hard crankbait gets ignored. During a bug hatch, shrink it all down and slow it all down to match what they're actually eating. Now the part that ties it together, and the whole point of this channel. You do not need a $2,000 screen to find summer walleye. The two tools that matter most cost almost nothing, and that's precisely why nobody advertises them. The first is a cheap water thermometer on a string. Even the walleye pros will tell you a temperature reading is one of the most valuable things on the boat because a couple of degrees tells you where the oxygen and the comfort are. The second is a free contour map from your state resource agency. Between those two, a $5 thermometer and a free map, you can locate the living band, the inflows, the flats, and the weed edges we've been talking about without spending a dime on electronics. The screen is a nice luxury. The knowledge is the actual edge, and the knowledge is free. So let me leave you with two things to argue about down in the comments, because I want to hear it. First, on your water, does the Mayfly hatch really kill the bite, or do you fish right through it? I've heard it both ways, loudly. Second, and this one's for everybody who's been told to go deep their whole life, what kind of lake do you fish? And does go deep in summer actually hold up where you are, or is it dead water down there? Tell me below. And whatever you do out there this season, check your state and local regulations, keep what you'll eat, let the rest breathe, and go read some living water.